Welcome back. It is a cold February morning in the year 1200, and inside the stone walls of an English castle, a king is already awake before the sun has fully cleared the horizon. He has slept in a bed piled with furs, in a chamber lit only by a single guttering candle, and yet he is already cold, because stone does not hold heat the way people imagine it does. Servants move past him in the dark, carrying water, stoking a fire that will never quite warm the room, and somewhere below, in the bailey, the ordinary business of feeding 400 people has already begun. You would think a king's life was one of comfort and ease. It was not. Today, using AI reconstructions, surviving architectural plans, and paintings from the centuries that followed, we are going to walk through a castle exactly as it stood in the year 1200, floor by floor, ritual by ritual, and by the end you will understand why almost no one alive today, however wealthy or however tough, would survive a single full day living as a medieval king actually lived. And when we are finished, we will step back into the present and see exactly what remains of these places now, stone by weathered stone. To understand why 1200 was such a demanding year to be a king, you have to go back further, to a time when castles were not symbols of grandeur at all, but desperate, practical answers to a violent problem. In the decades after the Norman conquest of 1066, the new rulers of England found themselves vastly outnumbered by a population that did not want them there. Early castles were not the towering stone fortresses we picture today. Many were simple motte and bailey structures, a mound of packed earth topped with a wooden tower, surrounded by a ditch and a fence, built in as little as a few weeks by forced local labor. These were raw, functional, almost crude installations, thrown up at chosen river crossings, trade routes, and hilltops to hold a hostile landscape by force. The people who built them had no illusions of permanence. Wood rotted, walls burned, and rulers changed. Nobody standing in the mud of one of those early bailey yards could have imagined that within 100 years, some of these same sites would carry towers of dressed stone 40 feet high, garrisoned by professional soldiers, and home to kings who ruled an empire stretching from the Scottish border to the south of France. By 1200, that transformation was complete, at least at the greatest of these sites. Picture the keep rising from its rock, its walls in places over 17 feet thick at the base, built from tens of thousands of blocks of quarried stone, hauled by ox cart and by barge, dressed by masons who worked outdoors through freezing winters for wages measured in pennies a day. The scale is difficult to grasp until you stand at the base of one of these towers and look up. Some keeps stood close to 100 feet tall, with walls that could take a decade or more to complete, and construction accounts from the period show staggering costs, in some cases equivalent to a significant portion of an entire kingdom's annual revenue poured into a single building project. Inside, the great hall smelled of wood smoke, tallow, roasting meat, and the damp wool of dozens of bodies packed close together for warmth. Sound carried strangely in these stone spaces, echoing off bare walls not yet softened by tapestry, and even at the height of a king's power, you would have seen scaffolding somewhere on the site almost constantly, because these were never finished buildings. A tower damaged in the last siege still waited for repair. A new curtain wall crept forward another few feet each season. A drawbridge mechanism, invented and refined only in living memory, required constant maintenance to keep from freezing shut or rotting through. This was a machine for living and fighting, not a museum piece, and everyone inside it knew it could be attacked again at any time. At the spiritual and administrative heart of the castle stood the chapel, often a small, jewel-like space compared to the massive military architecture around it. Its walls sometimes painted in reds and blues that have long since faded from what survives today. Here the king and his household heard mass, and here disputes were sometimes formally settled, because in 1200 there was no firm separation between religious authority and royal justice. A king ruled by what was widely believed to be divine right, and the church's blessing or its withdrawal could make or unmake a reign. Just 4 years after our snapshot, in 1204, King John would find himself locked in a bitter dispute with the Pope himself, one that would eventually see England placed under an interdict, church services suspended across the entire kingdom. Layered into the same stone corridors you might also find the Great Hall doubling as a courtroom, where the king or his justiciar heard grievances, settled land disputes, and dispensed punishment, blending governance, law, and religion into a single unbroken chain of authority that touched every person in the realm, from the highest baron to the lowest peasant working the fields beyond the walls. Step outside the Great Hall and into the bailey, and the atmosphere changes completely. This was the working heart of the castle, crowded and loud, home to blacksmiths hammering horseshoes, bakers pulling loaves from communal ovens, brewers producing the weak ale that was often safer to drink than water, and stable hands managing dozens of horses whose upkeep alone could consume a fortune. A major royal castle in this period might house a permanent population in the hundreds, a mix of household knights, men-at-arms, craftsmen, clergy, and servants, swelling further whenever the king's full court arrived, sometimes bringing hundreds more mouths to feed overnight. Daily life for most of these people was physically brutal, filled with 12 to 14-hour workdays, and utterly without privacy. Even the king rarely had a truly private moment, surrounded constantly by attendants whose job was quite literally to dress him, taste his food for poison, and sleep near his door. Graffiti and scratched marks found on castle stonework from this era, ranging from simple tally marks to crude drawings, hint at bored guards and workers passing long, cold hours on watch. A small human detail that connects directly across 8 centuries to anyone who has ever doodled through a dull shift at work. For entertainment and public spectacle, the castle's great hall could be transformed almost overnight into a stage for feasting, with long trestle tables set beneath banners, minstrels playing, and elaborate multi-course meals served to display wealth and power as much as to satisfy hunger. Tournaments, held in open fields near many major castles, drew huge crowds and turned mounted combat into a form of mass entertainment, complete with its own celebrity champions, serious injuries, and occasional deaths that were simply accepted as the cost of the spectacle. These events could draw hundreds of participating knights and thousands of spectators, becoming central to a noble sense of identity and reputation, not unlike major sporting events today, except that the athletes were armed with blunted lances and the stakes could genuinely be life or death. If the Great Hall represented public power, the king's private chambers represented something else entirely, a small world of curated luxury inside an otherwise brutal environment. Here you might find imported glass in narrow window openings, a genuine extravagance in 1200, along with painted wall plaster, carved wooden furniture, and textiles brought from as far away as the Mediterranean and beyond, carried along trade routes that stretched into the Byzantine world and even further east. A king's private wardrobe might include garments dyed with rare and expensive pigments, some derived from shellfish harvested and processed at enormous cost, producing a purple color so associated with royalty that its use by lesser nobles was sometimes restricted by law. And yet, for all this luxury, comfort remained relative. Even royal chambers were drafty, poorly heated by modern standards, and offered no real escape from the political violence that defined the age. Whatever silk or fur surrounded a king in his private rooms, it would not protect him from what was coming, because in this era, privilege bought comfort, but it never bought safety. The turning point for castles like these did not usually come as a single dramatic night, but as a grinding, months-long ordeal known as a siege, and few illustrate this better than what unfolded at one of England's great southeastern fortresses in the summer of 1216. King John had died that October, leaving behind a 9-year-old heir and a kingdom torn by civil war, with rebellious barons having already invited a French prince to cross the Channel and claim the English throne for himself. That summer, an invading force numbering in the thousands surrounded the castle, deploying siege engines capable of hurling stones weighing dozens of kilograms against the walls, while sappers dug tunnels beneath the towers, packing the excavated chambers with timber and setting them alight in an attempt to collapse the foundations from below. Inside, the garrison, numbering only in the low hundreds, held on through weeks of bombardment, believing at times that the walls themselves would simply give way beneath them, when in reality the massive stone construction, built decades earlier by careful royal engineers, was absorbing damage far better than either side expected. A section of one gatehouse tower did eventually collapse under the mining assault, and desperate close combat reportedly broke out in the resulting breach. Yet the defenders managed to hold the line and seal the gap with improvised timber barricades. The siege dragged on for months before eventually lifting, as the wider war turned in favor of the young king's supporters, and the castle, battered but unbroken, remained in royal hands. In the years and centuries that followed many such castles, this one included, the political and military landscape shifted dramatically. As gunpowder artillery matured in the following centuries, the thick stone walls that had defied trebuchets and mining crews became increasingly vulnerable to cannon fire, and the enormous cost of maintaining a full military garrison in peacetime grew harder to justify. Some castles were slighted, deliberately damaged by later governments to prevent them from being used again in future rebellions. Others were simply abandoned to the elements, their lead roofing stripped and sold, their dressed stone quarried away by local builders for cottages and field walls. A slow scavenging that could strip a once mighty fortress down to bare, roofless ruins within a few generations. Weeds took root in collapsed halls where kings had once dined. Livestock sheltered in chambers where private councils had once decided the fate of a kingdom. It was not until centuries later, particularly from the 18th and 19th centuries onward, that renewed interest in medieval history brought antiquarians, then trained archaeologists, back to these sites with genuine scholarly purpose. Excavations uncovered building foundations, kitchen middens full of animal bone revealing exactly what medieval households ate, and in some cases surprisingly intact sections of original stonework buried beneath centuries of collapsed debris. What struck early investigators most was not the grandeur, which they expected, but the intimacy of what survived: worn stone steps hollowed by thousands of footsteps, a garderobe shaft revealing exactly how sanitation actually worked, tally marks and graffiti confirming that ordinary, bored, cold human beings had once lived their entire working lives inside these walls. It is worth pausing here briefly to remember what these ruins actually represent. Long before they became tourist attractions or backdrops for photographs, these were homes. People were born within these walls and died within them. Children ran through courtyards that visitors now walk in near silence. Every worn stone stair was shaped by real footsteps, climbed thousands of times by people whose names, in most cases, we will never know. Today, if you travel to one of England's great surviving medieval castles, you can walk through a keep whose walls still stand largely as they did in 1200, climbing the same spiral stairs, ducking through the same low doorways built for a shorter, harder living population. The Great Hall, now roofless or carefully restored, still gives a sense of its original scale, even without the smoke and crowd noise that once filled it. The chapel survives in several such sites almost entirely intact, its stonework still bearing faint traces of medieval paint if you know exactly where to look. The bailey, once packed with workshops and stables, is now open lawn, dotted with information panels rather than blacksmiths' forges. Sections of the very gatehouse tower damaged during that 13th century siege can still be seen today, its rebuilt stonework subtly different in color and style from the original construction, a visible scar in the architecture itself. The king's private chambers, stripped of their tapestries and furniture long ago, now display careful modern reconstructions based on surviving inventories and archaeological evidence, giving visitors a genuine sense of what royal luxury actually looked like 8 centuries ago. Standing in these spaces now with modern lighting, walking paths, and safety railings, it takes real imagination to reconstruct the cold, the smoke, the crowding, and the constant underlying threat of violence that defined castle life in 1200. But the stones themselves, patient and unmoved by any of it, are still there to help you try. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. If you enjoyed walking through this castle with me, let me know in the comments, and tell me which place, event, or lost world you would like to see brought back to life next. Your suggestions genuinely shape what we cover here, so keep them coming, and I will see you in the next one.